I tell you a true crime story and we drink. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you choose to enjoy one of our themed margaritas, please ensure that you are of legal drinking age and have fun but drink responsibly. In 1936, the sad face of a 22-year-old socialite was plastered on newspapers across the United States. Stories would be printed about her entire private life, from her childhood to her romances, to her drinking, to her French lingerie. The country was enraptured with her story, much as they had been with her socialite mother's love life, which included a variety of husbands and lovers. But they were fascinated with her daughter for another reason. Anne Cooper Hewitt was suing her mother Marion for having her sterilized without her knowledge or her consent.
Today's margaritas, only for the most rich and famous, obviously. Because of the decadent, well, sort of, upbringing of our main character, Anne, we had to create a champagne margarita. Can you hear the bubbly? I think I'm gonna really like this one because, for one, I like when my margaritas have a little bit of carbonation because I think it really lightens up the drink. Also, I like any chance to drink the champagne. So for today's margarita, we did go ahead and add 3 parts champagne, 1 part lime juice, 1 part tequila, and of course, 1 part triple sec. We will, as usual, shake, and as with all the carbonated ones, we gotta be careful. Just be really gentle with your shaking. Y'all, I just said to be gentle with the shaking and the lid popped off, but we've got some left. So with what's left, we'll strain over a sugar-rimmed glass. I'm gonna go wash myself off before we start.
Yay for another book recommendation. This one is called The Unfit Heiress, The Tragic Life and Scandalous Sterilization of Anne Cooper Hewitt by Audrey Clare Farley. This one is in the style of book that I basically love the most. It's pretty much fictionalized nonfiction. So while it's based in a ton of historical research, including letters, newspaper articles, and a lot of other primary sources, she sort of fills in the gaps using some creative license, which makes it really a page turner. And good news, I have a copy that will be entered into the giveaway at the end of the year. If you're wondering how you'll be entered, well, let's just say it'll involve subscribing to different parts of the mayhem. So if you haven't subscribed to the podcast or the YouTube or our different social media channels, I suggest getting on that. Our story today doesn't begin with our survivor, Anne Cooper Hewitt, but instead begins with her mother, Marion. Marion Andrews was born in 1884. She moved to New York City from California in 1903 with a singular goal: to rise in the social ranks. She was already married to a California doctor, but soon began to dress to impress in the New York social circles. Her husband began to worry that she was sort of partying a little bit too hard and became relieved when he found out she was pregnant because he thought that would really slow her down some. Motherhood definitely did not slow her down. And after the birth of her son, Pedar, she left him almost exclusively in the care of her mother-in-law and continued with her night owl, social scene, bar, partying ways. As could probably be expected, that marriage ended up dissolving. Another 3-month marriage to a Wall Street broker managed to increase her social credibility just enough for her to end that marriage. She then set her sights on a wealthy inventor, Peter Cooper Hewitt. Peter was the inventor of a very efficient mercury vapor lamp, and he came from intelligent lineage. His grandfather had been the inventor of gelatin desserts and had been a part of the invention of the steam engine. Never mind that Peter was already married. Marian managed to sweep him off of his feet and get his mind off of his inventions for a while. Before long, Marian was pregnant, and 2 months early, she gave birth to a daughter, whom she named Anne. Anne weighed 3.5 pounds and had slicked back black hair. Marian was in France at the time, and the day of Anne's birth, July 28th, 1914, was the very day that World War I began. Marian would often remind Anne of this when she misbehaved, telling her that she had been born on an evil day. Marian was also mad because she had wished for a boy and was turned off by the fact that Anne was so small, half the size of her previous child, Pedar, and had a very terrible and ugly hair. Because World War I had just broken out in Europe, Peter demanded that the three, Marian, Pedar, and baby Anne, come back immediately to the United States. Things were not safe in Europe because, war. Marian reluctantly agreed, and on the ship that would return them to the United States, she actually hired a nurse to take care of her children, and she would often go days without seeing her infant child. From the very beginning, Marian was disgusted with Anne, especially with her looks and with her insufferable, which is really just normal, baby crying. She told Pedar and many others that something wasn't right with baby Anne. Peter, upon seeing his then month-old daughter, was enraptured by her. He loved her very much. He put the three of them in an apartment in Upper Manhattan, close to his laboratory, but sort of out of view of the public. He visited as often as he could, but Marian was unhappy. She really wanted to move back to France and eventually insisted upon it, and Peter relented. Peter divorced his first wife, married Marian, and all four of them moved to France to start a new life together. The marriage, however, sent the press into a tailspin. A full-page article in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, which was dedicated to their marriage, was titled, "Why Brainy Men Often Marry Frivolous Wives." Many more articles tackled the subject of the two of them. Meanwhile, they did live as a family in France, taking many trips together, including back to the United States to visit. Peter always returned by himself to the United States in the fall and the winter to continue with his work. During these times, little Anne was often left alone. She didn't do well in school, probably because her mom would constantly tell teachers that she was slow and unable to learn. This caused her to be ridiculed by her classmates and her teachers. She loved her father and was in turn doted on by him, but she only saw him for about half of the year. And in the times she was alone with her mother, it was filled with loneliness and neglect, if not outright abuse. When Anne asked for her father, Marian would often ask why he would want to come home to a daughter who was so rotten. Anne grew up seeking love and affection in whatever places that she could. When she was a toddler, she was caught putting her hands in her underwear, a behavior that is perfectly normal and acceptable for children at her age. But from that point forward, her mother labeled her not only as slow, but as sexually deviant. At one point, she was institutionalized for really no reason, and she made friends with a boy that was her own age. One night, she snuck into his room because she loved hearing him tell her stories, but they were caught, furthering her mother's narrative. In the summer of 1920, Peter fell ill and had his appendix removed. His health continued to worsen, and by the next year, he was too weak to pick Anne up. At this point, she was only 6. Meanwhile, Marian had refused to care for Peter in his convalescence and had actually just gone out and started an affair with another man, Baron Robert d'Erlanger, a man who really didn't have very much money, but had something that Marian really wanted: a title. In August of 1921, Peter was nearing his end, And it's possible Marion made that end come a little bit sooner than it really should have. A nurse would later testify to as much, despite Marion claiming that that nurse had actually stolen jewels from the family, getting her imprisoned. Yet the nurse did not change her story, a story in which Marion had approached her on Peter's deathbed and had given her a substance to give to Peter that would relieve his pain, supposedly. When the nurse refused to give that liquid substance, she believed that Marion had come in later and had given Peter the substance herself. For that alleged crime, Marion got nothing except for a new marriage that didn't last very long. In his will, Peter left his vast fortune to Anne and Marion. He left 2/3 actually to Anne and 1/3 to Marion. But there was an odd stipulation even for that era. If Anne were to die childless, the portion of that inheritance would return to Marion. More on that later. In 1924, Pedar, Marion, and Anne returned to the United States, and Anne continued to have sporadic schooling at best. Marion had a habit of firing governesses for any real or perceived small or large slight. Marion introduced her daughter by saying, "You'll have to excuse my daughter, she's not quite right," in social settings and with acquaintances. Marion also married for the 5th time, but her husband lost his patience for her drinking to excess and getting them banished from social clubs that he had been in for decades. At this time, debt collectors also started coming after Marion for accounts that she had opened in New York City, many from before she had even moved to France. She also continued being newspaper fodder, once being compared for a sort of emerging chrysalis for the number of marriages and changed last names that she had. Anne would say later that one of the few things her mother had done for her was to give her kind stepfathers. 11 months before Anne turned 21, in August of 1934, she fell ill with stomach pains while on vacation in San Diego on the beach. During this time, the age of majority or adulthood was 21 years old. This becomes important later. Seemingly worried about her daughter's health, Marion declared that Anne had an appendicitis and insisted that they head immediately back to San Francisco. An 8-hour drive. She was immediately taken to the Dante Sanatorium, where they met their private family physician. In a room, she was questioned about her knowledge of American history by a psychologist. That same psychologist would identify that she had the mental age of an 11-year-old. Yes, based on her knowledge of American history, they declared that she had the mental aptitude of an 11-year-old. By the way, later the judge in the trial would ask that same psychologist to give him the test that he had given to Anne, and he would be tested at the aptitude of a 12-year-old. The doctors never actually examined her abdomen or asked her any questions about her symptoms. They would instead put her under anesthesia, remove her fallopian tubes, and render her completely and irreversibly sterile. The moment Anne turned 21 and could access her trust fund on her own, she moved out from her mother's apartment. She had known for some time that her mother had done this to her and had likely made her sick in the first place. She moved in with one of her ex-stepfathers and their new wife and hired a lawyer, determined to seek justice for what had been done to her. Anne loved literature and could write fluently in English, French, and converse in Italian. She enjoyed music and art and was a prolific painter. Any gaps in her education were due to inconsistent and informal schooling, not a lack of mental capacity. As soon as she moved out of her mother's house, she stopped bleaching her hair, which she had done to please her mother for many years. She interviewed with as many newspapers as she could, hoping that they would take her photograph and that her mother would see that she was no longer under her thumb. Anne filed a $500,000 civil lawsuit against her mother. Her mother had secretly paid 2 California physicians, with money from Anne's own trust fund, I should add, in order to ensure that Anne's portion of the estate would return to Marion upon Anne's death. The argument was that her mother's arrogance led her to fully believe that she would outlive her daughter. Or perhaps she would do something to her daughter that was similar to what she had done to her dead husband, number 3 or 4, whatever. In addition, criminal charges were filed against Marion and the 2 doctors, and those would be 2 separate trials. Marion fled to New Jersey, fighting extradition back to California because of a suicide attempt and several ailments that happened as a result of this suicide attempt. So the trial for the doctors would happen first. If the court found any doubt about Anne's mental capacity, the 2 doctors could be convicted of mayhem, which is, yes, a real criminal charge, and they would face a prison sentence of a decade or more. The trial became a very public display of Anne's childhood, her temperament, her behaviors, and really the personal life of Marion and Anne itself. Her mother had been abusive, according to Anne, and she showed the court a scar on her forehead that had been from a wine glass that she said her mom had threw at her head, and a cigarette burn on her arm that she said Marion had done when she hadn't approved of one of Anne's suitors. Even if she hadn't been abused, neglect was fairly obvious. Many of the nurses and maids in their life testified to the fact that Anne had been neglected even from birth, when Marion had outright even refused to nurse Anne. She called her an imbecile and an ugly duckling to her face. Marion characterized Anne to news reporters, acquaintances, and the general public as spoiled, stupid, and sexed. Anne's half-brother, Pedar, submitted an affidavit in support of his mother. He said that Marion had raised Anne perfectly and showed her nothing but love and support. The criminal case against the 2 doctors who had performed the sterilization was dismissed. Sterilization was legal in California under certain circumstances, and the judge referred to it as a useless expenditure of funds. It didn't really matter if Anne was deviant or developmentally disabled or delayed. The doctors had simply not even committed a crime. Meanwhile, Marion was still in New Jersey. She had managed to persuade her doctor to let any messages that went out to the general public or to the courts about her to be approved by her before they went out. The San Francisco DA, however, was determined to make Marion pay for her crimes. It would be Anne that would prevent a criminal trial against Marion. She found out that her mother really had tried to commit suicide, versus what she thought before, which was that she had just faked it. Anne wanted justice for what had been done to her, but she didn't want to kill her mother. The courts delayed the trial for a while, but Anne would not relent and still refused to testify, so the criminal charges were dropped. Anne settled the civil suit for $150,000 and didn't speak to her mother for the rest of her life. Anne was not even close to the only person who faced a forced sterilization in the United States. Eugenics in the United States has a long and sordid history. The word eugenics means well-born, and the eugenics movement in the United States focused primarily on removing negative traits seen in humans. As you can imagine, negative traits is a pretty purely subjective term. Indiana was the first to enact a sterilization law in 1907, but by 1931, 29 states, including California, had sterilization laws on the books. These laws had outlined the goals eugenicists had in the United States. Force sterilizations of populations of people that had undesirable traits. This started with people with disabilities, but then was expanded to people who were impoverished, people from, quote, undesirable minority populations, and then people who were just uneducated. Adolf Hitler based his blueprint of eugenics on what was already happening in the United States. In the United States alone, 64,000 people, and that's an estimate, were sterilized against their will or through various forms of coercion. In California alone, over 20,000 Men and women in state-run institutions were sterilized against their will. That represents 1/3 of the sterilizations that happened in the United States. In the southern United States, Black women were sterilized at such a rate that it developed a term, Mississippi appendectomy. In the 1970s alone, an estimated 25% of Indigenous women living on reservations were involuntarily sterilized. It wasn't until 1981 that the last forced sterilization was done in Oregon. That was only 40 years ago, my friends. And there are allegations that coerced sterilizations continue. Inmates in the California prison system have been sterilized as recently as 2010, either through coercion or by not understanding that the procedure was permanent. So what do you think? Why did Marion do something so terrible and irreversible to her daughter? What was her motive? Do you think she really thought there was something wrong with her daughter, or was there something else there? And poor Anne. Should Anne have given up her desire to see her mom face justice for what she had done to her? How do you think that trauma, as well as the other trauma that she had faced in her life, affected her? What would you have done in this situation? And what do you think about our horrible history of eugenics in the United States? Did you know this part of our past, or is this new to you? How does it make you feel knowing these things? And especially knowing that it ended such a short time ago, or frankly, might still be happening. Marion died of cerebral apoplexy, or a stroke, at age 59 in April of 1939. Her daughter had not spoken to her since she had turned 21 years old. But she did leave Anne some jewels and other knickknacks. She left her monetary inheritance to her son, Pedar, but after she had paid back all of her debt collectors, turns out those jewels and other knickknacks were actually worth more than the monetary inheritance. Like her mother, Anne herself married 5 times, unable to make relationships last. She married a car mechanic, but that relationship lasted 3 months. According to the mechanic, the marriage had ended because Anne had been unable to confide in him about her past and had an unreasonable expectation about making him her possession. Another marriage came and went, lasting only 3 months. She married again, divorcing under the guise of wanting to run for the U.S. Senate. The marriage and the Senate run met the same untimely end. She married Frank Nicholson twice, with another marriage in between. But she and Frank ended up staying together until her death in February of 1956. They were living in Monterrey, Mexico, where she developed cancer and died at age 40. She left her entire inheritance to her husband, except for $1 that she left to her half-brother Pedar, a little F.U. at the end. She was buried in Monterrey, and despite her husband's promises that he would also be buried there, he was not. So even in death, Anne rests alone. The Cooper Hewitt family removed Marion and Anne from basically all of the family records. They really saw the 2 women as a stain on the family legacy. They cannot be found in any of the Cooper Hewitt family collections, and they are not a part of any of the various institutions founded by the Cooper Hewitt family. The author of the book I recommended suggests that Marion's various marriages in order to improve her social status were similar to what men did during the era. She simply did what she could do using the tools that she had in order to improve her life and her wealth and her social status. She argues that Marion was simply using the tools that she had in the time that she lived. Maybe the same goes for Anne, but I think really Anne was just seeking love. But the amount of trauma that she faced in her childhood and her young adulthood made finding a stable relationship pretty much impossible. Anne's failed marriages didn't have anything to do with the fact that she couldn't have children. She brought the baggage of her childhood so prominently into those relationships, it was almost impossible for them to succeed. Never mind the absolute microscope of scrutiny that she faced, both before and after the sensational trial. I think about how hard it is for Hollywood celebrities to maintain relationships in the face of the relentless press coverage that they face. And I think it was probably pretty similar to that same amount of scrutiny that Anne and to some degree Marian endured. It's really no wonder that Anne lived such a difficult, lonely life. Thanks for hanging out with me. If you have an idea for a case or more importantly a margarita, head on over to our social media sites. We're on Instagram and Facebook, and the links are always in the description box below. I'm really thankful to everyone who has liked and subscribed and reviewed on all the various places that you can find Marks and Mayhem. Next week we head across the pond to explore another historical case, this time from England. And man, this woman really got her revenge or her fortune or I don't know, something. We're using a British liqueur for next week, Pimm's. Luckily, you should be able to find it in most liquor stores, so get shopping. I'll see you next week, and remember, there are always alternatives to murder and secretly sterilizing your daughter.